James Hughes, what a privilege to have this conversation with you here in America. And I'm really deeply grateful to you for making this time. And I would love to introduce you. I got to know about you through your first book that you've written, Family Wealth, and that you published, first self-published and then got published in 2004. And when I read the book, it opened up a window of a new way to look at families and how families generate an impact and their wealth of experiences and financial wealth, how that goes from generation to generation. And I know that your book has been read by many people, and you've written 4 more books. I know you are bringing out your 4th one soon. The second one that you published was Family, the Compact Among Generations.
Yes.
And which one was your 3rd one that you published?
The 3rd one is called The Cycle of the Gift.
The Cycle of the Gift, yes.
And the 4th one is called The Voice of the Rising Generation.
And The Voice of the Rising Generation was written for the 2nd generation,
Yes.
for the ones who is taking over the wealth creation from the 1st generation. And we will be
Yes.
talking a lot about that in our conversation. And then the one that you're busy writing now?
It's called Family Trusts, Family Wealth and Wisdom, a guide to beneficiaries, trustees, trust protectors, and their advisors.
Can't wait to read that. And you said that there is one more book that is in the making.
Yes, my co-authors, Keith Whitaker and Susan Masenzio, and I have committed either next year or in 2017 to writing a book called The Wisdom Keepers, the Role of Elders in Families.
And I am convinced that it is going to really serve us who have a heart to know how to do it. So I thank you for your dedication and your willingness to share your wisdom with us. There are so many of us that are deeply grateful for that. And I would like for us to have a conversation around how do we help families to understand, first of all, the proverb from shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve. I find it fascinating that many of the families I'm working with, they don't even know about the proverb, but they are living the experience of it. And I know that when I had a conversation with you a couple of months ago, you told me the fascinating story how you in your early 30s was called to go to Singapore. And please share that story. I find it so inspiring.
Well, with pleasure. Imagine me sitting on the 13th floor of a skyscraper in New York City in an office of a law firm called Couder Brothers, and being 1 week away from the partnership election. And I knew that my name had been put into a nomination. And in the last few months of the year before you become a partner in a law firm, you tend to try to be as invisible as possible. So I was sitting there on Tuesday, and one of the partners came into my office and said, "Jay, we want you to go to Singapore on Saturday." And I said, "But why?" He said, "Well, we have a client there who wants to talk to you." And I said, "Do I know him?" He said, "No, you don't. You never met him." I said, "Charlie, you can't be serious." He said, "Yes, on Saturday you need to be on an airplane." I said, "I don't have a passport." He said, "Well, get one." And in those days, you could actually walk over to Fifth Avenue and in an afternoon get a passport. So I did. And I went home to my wife and 3 very small children. We got out an atlas to try to find out where Singapore was. Where was Daddy going? And on Saturday morning, very early, I went off to the airport. And we flew and flew and flew and flew and flew because there were no 747s. And we finally got to Singapore on the Sunday afternoon. And I was picked up by my resident partner, and he asked me how was the flight, et cetera. And I said, fine. By the way, I said, "Gage, why does this man want to see me, and do you know him?" And Gage said, "No, we have no idea." I said, "Come on, you can't be serious." He said, "I'm serious, we don't know." Well, I was beginning to be very agitated and anxious. So that evening, I had dinner with 2 of his sons, and I had met them in New York for maybe half an hour, some months before. And I asked them the same question. "Do you know why your father has invited me to come?" And they said no. I said, does he do things like this very often? And they said, no, he's a very serious businessman, and no, we don't understand it either. So Monday morning, I got up, went down to Tanglin Road, went up to the 17th floor of this building, and I got off the elevator, and there was nothing but a wall. Nothing but a wall, and a secretary sitting, and a door. And I said, hi, I'm Mr. Hughes, and she said, oh, you're expected, go through that door. So I went through the door and found myself in an enormous office, the whole top of the building, a large office building. And this Chinese gentleman was sitting at the end of the room in a chair raised up from the floor. Mm-hmm. And in front of his desk is a tiny chair.
Just one chair waiting for you.
That was it. Some couches way off to the sides and a big oil painting of a man who I later discovered was his father. That was it. So I had to walk from where I was and sit in that chair, and it felt like an eternity to get there. I did it. I sat down, we shook hands, and he said, would you like tea? And of course I thought, in China I'd take tea. Then he said, would you like a cigar? And I said, yes, I don't smoke cigars. And finally he said, Mr. Hughes, you probably wonder why I've invited you to come. I said, yes, sir. He said, well, we Chinese have a proverb, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And I shouted back at him. I couldn't avoid it, but that happened in my family. We have the proverb too. And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Hughes, I want you to tell me what the families in the West do to avoid this outcome. I don't want my family to have this outcome. So I said to him, Ilse, well, I don't know. I said, but would you welcome me back in 6 months? And I'll give you the answer. He said that would be fine. So we shook hands. I felt much better. The walk between the chair and the door was now very short because I was on my way. 6 months to the day, I got back. And he said, have you the answer? And I said, no. He said, oh, I'm very disappointed. I said, well, I can tell you this. I said, in 6 months, I've discovered that every culture on earth has this proverb. Every single one. Rags to riches to rags, clogs to clogs, rice paddy to rice paddy, stable boy to horse wren to stable boy. Every culture on earth has the proverb. And I said to him, so I think what we must do is we must see in the context of your family how to avoid this outcome. And then I said to him something else that's continued to be in front of me now 40 plus years. This is not able to be overcome. It is possible to avoid it. And that is what I've learned, because every day of my life I still am learning about this proverb.
And you have dedicated 50 years of your life to seeking the answer to avoid it. We know that, and we had a conversation with a family earlier on, we discussed the phenomena that the second generation, or if we first go and explain what shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve, what that stands for. So the first generation creates the wealth because there's something that has really driven, there's a big void. I'm thinking of a family that I'm working with, whose story is the dad was 14 years old and he left his country, Cyprus, to go to Africa, and he couldn't speak English. And at the age of 14, without any family member, he arrived in South Africa and he had nothing and nobody. So his void and that emptiness in him to create something with his life was so massive that he's a man in his late 70s now. He's created family wealth because he had nothing and he wanted to build something for his life, and that is the typical first generation. Then the second generation becomes the custodians of the wealth. Mm-hmm. And the third generation who got so used to the lifestyle, and if there's not a method and a structure and a foundation and a mindset and a psychology being transferred to them, they live it out. Mm-hmm. And that you see is happening in all cultures in the world. It's not only a Chinese proverb.
It's not only not just a Chinese proverb. Ilse, you stated it beautifully. Many years ago, and this constant search for a way to provide a family with intention, it's a very important word, to avoid this outcome, it occurred to me that it is essentially no more and no less than one of the fundamental laws of physics. So if we think of that marvelous 14-year-old with all of his life in front of him, with the courage to leave home forever, that's an enormously important existential act, an act of existence. He not only had a dream, but he did something that is godlike with a small g. That is, he made energy matter.
Mm-hmm. Please.
That really shouldn't be possible for a human being in this universe, and yet, of course, it happens with stars and stardust every day. The reality of our universe, though, is that it is all energy. So there is this small amount of matter, smaller all the time when we measure it.
Yes.
And what we know is that in families and in the universe, they are the same. Anything which becomes material must eventually go back to energy. Such are the laws of our universe. The great question of avoidance is the question of accretion of energy. Because the proverb doesn't say when, it just says will. Now this is not subtle, this is very, very important. I'm going to say it again. The proverb doesn't tell you when it will happen, because you don't know when the third generation will be in the proverb. It could be the 10th generation. All the proverb says, and Mother Nature is infinitely kind, she tells you it will happen. Every family has free will as to when. And the question of when is constantly postponed, I've learned, all over the world, by the families who don't have this outcome. When they accrete energy, they make new matter. But the matter isn't money. They make new great human beings.
Yes. And isn't that what true family wealth is? I know that people, when we talk about family wealth, they think of the financial wealth. But you and I both know that it is far beyond just family, the financial wealth. The wealth of a family lies in the individuals, in the human capital. I have incorporated the mindset and the teachings of Dr. John DeMartini, the human behavior specialist and polymath, who is sharing that there are 7 areas of life, and that is your spiritual wealth. I see that family wealth lies in spiritual wealth, in your mental wealth, your vocational wealth, your financial wealth, your family relationship wealth, your social relationships wealth, and your physical health and vitality. You also, in your books and in our conversation, you bring it back to the human being, the humans, the individuals of the family. The wealth lies in that. Please expand on that.
Well, first, I think Mr. DeMartini's way of seeing and visioning the multiple ways that we are and that our families are is to be celebrated. All too frequently, we fail to see that each of these is a system. Each of these is an energy that becomes matter, and each of them is in danger of the matter becoming energy. So a systems approach to each of these and the secretion of energy is the suspension of when. What I've seen, Ilse, over the years, and is I'll come at it this way. Many years ago, I wanted to try to dispose of the word wealth, because I believed that what it did in the brain was to immediately connect to financial capital, money. And that's too many, but hundreds of times before audiences, I've asked them to do this little exercise. I've asked them to answer the question of what does the word wealth mean? And of course, people think I'm crazy, and they just all shell out money and financial wealth. I said, well, okay. But I said, suppose for a moment that you were sitting in the most beautiful place on earth where you go and repose. Such a beautiful, serene place. And suppose you invited those you love the most to come there with you. And they came. And they experienced that with you. Isn't that your wealth? Now, what happens in the brain and the heart as they connect to different brains is that when you are in that serene place with those you love the most, you discover your wealth. So even though I wanted to dispose of the word, I realized it is the right word.
It is the right word. Yeah.
Now, in a very simple way to help all of us imagine what we are saying, I'll use a little hand signal.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose your thumb is financial capital.
Yes.
Suppose your first finger is human capital, all those human beings. Your second is intellectual, what you know, what you share. Third is social, are you making good decisions together? Are you growing? Are you helping the world? And fourth is spiritual capital. This is what I've learned in 50 years. If the financial is leading, these disappear.
Okay. Yes.
They just disappear. Now suppose you turn your hand upside down. And suppose now the financial capital is supporting. That's all it's doing. The growth of your human selves, your intellectual selves, your social selves, and your spiritual selves. Now you're right-oriented. Now you're postponing when. So very often when I'm sitting with families or I'm with audiences and the question of wealth emerges, I will just put my thumb up, not say a word. Everything goes silent. And I watch the thumbs go down. Quietly, peacefully, meditatively reorienting.
Yes. Going to the being of it, and this is the doing of it.
Absolutely. And this doing is fine. But these beings are what changes the when of avoiding the proverb.
So James, I have found many encounters where when I introduce myself and I tell people I'm a wealth psychologist, they immediately want to put me in the category of I just work with the finances, but I work with the wealth of the family. Because I believe the ultimate purpose of a family is to encourage the fulfillment and prosperity of every family member. And that has become such a nice analogy and a metaphor for me to use with them. So I thank you for introducing me to this. You also talk about the family balance sheet, and I have found that so useful in the work that I do with families, where we look at the assets, the liabilities in the family. And I want to ask you to just expand on that. You have opened up a different way for families to look at the wealth in their family.
Well, thank you. When I was beginning to think about this and writing the first edition of Family Wealth, and appreciating that the generations would read this book differently, I was trying to find ways to illustrate to the different generations what I thought their tasks were. And I don't think I'm naive after this many years at this, being an outlier. And I realized that the first generation would be most comfortable reading, in the way we're discussing this, the dreamer, would be most comfortable trying to use ideas in the form of accounting mechanisms. So it occurred to me that there is no reason why one cannot manage and measure one's human capital. How are the human beings thriving? Do they have dreams? Can they experience joy? Are they interested in a long journey? Can we establish our intellectual capital? Of course we can. Every corporation on earth, including all these first generation men and women, are measuring their intellectual capital every day in the world that we live in. Can we measure social capital? Of course, by the quality, not quantity, of the decisions we make. Are we making decisions together that are high quality, that are leading to higher ground? Or are we making decisions that are leading away from consensus? Are we making gifts rather than transfers in our social capital to the rest of the world. We can measure this. Spiritual capital is also measurable. Now, without diminishing the extraordinary energy that lies in the spirit, what is the qualitative measurement of spiritual capital? Do we have a common vision? Can we see our great-grandchildren flourishing? Can we understand harvesting of the things that we've created in the natural way of life? We can understand and qualitatively understand our spiritual capital. So what I realized also is that it's quite easy to make a balance sheet of these 5 capitals, all 5, and also express the liabilities.
And what will be liabilities on a family balance sheet?
Well, the first one is where we began our conversation, and that is that the shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve proverb will always be present. Mother Nature will always be standing there, and so the problem is us. That is the liability that never goes away. But then there are other things, such as inadequate learning, inadequate interest in the dreams of the next generation, inadequate interest in the problems of the world, inadequate interest in making good decisions by consensus, not by fiat or direction. There are all kinds of liabilities, poor health, the Holocaust, external events. All of these I have seen great families manage. That doesn't mean they don't take losses in the fundamental sense of these capitals.
Yes.
But they are immensely resilient because they spend their time together on adaptation. They understand that any number of things can come from outer space, can come from their own inadequacies. They are constantly asking themselves the question, are we adapting to the issues of ours, internal or external? And are we building resilience? Are we becoming our own best advocates because of the resilience of our system?
It reminds me of the story of Max Planck. After he received the Nobel Prize, he was traveling from university to university to go and speak. And his chauffeur would drive him around and would go into the venues and listen to his talk. And after he heard it about 100 times, he said to Max Planck, I've heard your speech more than 100 times now. I can offer the speech. And Max Planck said to him, you're the speaker at the next event. And I will sit in the audience as your chauffeur. And he gave the speech apparently brilliantly. And then someone in the audience stood up and asked a question which the chauffeur, of course, couldn't answer. And he said, that is such an elementary question. I want to ask my chauffeur to answer the question.
This is resilience.
That's resilience.
And adaptability.
And adaptability. And also that made me think about, that is for me the mindset of the second generation. Because you can so easily say, I know it all. I can give the speech. I know how to take the family vision forward. But I also found in the families I work with that in the second generation, often they build up a resistance and even a resentment that they perceive that they are just a custodian of the wealth created, the first generation's wealth creation dream, family vision, and now they just look after that, and their own vision, their own dreams for their life have to take second place. So Max Planck's story reminds me of that. I can think that I have the answers, but isn't it wise to keep on going back and learn from the teacher who has learned in their own way how to create what they created out of their own big voids? So is the first generation the teacher as well?
Yes, in the sense of an understanding of the core human virtues of curiosity creativity, willingness to suspend personal goals for a higher goal. The first generation represents a number of great virtues. Sadly, and we must honor what we've learned, the second generation comes to life in the face of those virtues, and with a great deal of direction that they should practice these same virtues. However, the shadow side of the first generation, and as Freud and Jung and our great teachers taught both of us, there is a shadow human side to everything. The problem of the first generation is that as it becomes convinced by its own success, forgetting those virtues, speaking them but forgetting them, it begins to believe that the only dream is its own, and that the task of those who come after it is to steward or conserve that dream. This is the shadow side that gives the lie to all of those virtues. The second generation's great task is to evolve, with the help of its advisors, its own dreams. Not at the expense of the first generation's dream, but at the possibility of their own individuation and differentiation. Why? Well, because this is human. And this is what grows these capitals, rather than their disappearing in the face of this one. It's deeply humane. And yet, Ilse, this is the odd thing. By and large, no one cares about the second generation. The huge materiality of energy that has occurred in this creative, curious process becomes identified as that family, not they themselves. They become that, not this. This is where the family energy begins to dissipate. So it isn't that it isn't important for the first generation's dream to be nurtured. What is rather important is that the people nurturing it are called to that work, rather than identified as children who must do that work. The great balancing is advisors understanding this issue, standing apart from the first generation dream, and holding the second generation safe, and saying, what are your dreams?
And give them the permission to live their dreams as well.
Yes, and if we think of this in the most humane way, and the evolving way of first individuation, then differentiation, the gifts of Jung, we come to the third stage of life, which is integration. Now, this second generation person, toward that stage of his or her life, having brought a dream to life, been curious, been creative, done these things, may be big enough then, now to deal with stewarding. But through the fusion, in the high sense, of his or her dream and this dream, to take a higher ground.
It reminds me of the conversation we had with a couple before we started this conversation. And he was sharing with us that he comes from a well-to-do family and he's third generation. And you're asking the question, is your mother passing the dream, or is she ruling? And he said she's ruling. Now, I know she's not intending any harm for her family. She's doing it out of the goodness and because in her perception, that's the best. Because I believe every human being does what they believe is the best with what they have. But the impact on the children is beyond what she's understanding. And I'm wondering if we get to the opportunity to work with a mother, a father like that, what will we be able to help them with? That there's a transformation. You can't stop energy. You can't. It cannot be dissipated. But how do you help them to have a different why they want to do it? And how do you transform that energy that this next generation say, I'm buying into it because I can see the fulfillment and prosperity for me and for my children and beyond?
Ilse, this is one of the great unknowns remaining in my life. And if I said I had an answer to that, I would be prevaricating. What I think I could say at this point in my journey is that the family members, such as the mother of our friend, when they come to me in some grief, often sent by their children, by the way, they don't come voluntarily, they ask me exactly your question. And the best answer I can give them is, well, what is your intention? And they usually give me what I would call a nice answer.
Please.
And then I say, I don't think so. And since I'm of a certain age, and unlike almost anyone they've ever met, I don't care whether they need me or don't. I'm just there to be a voice. They realize that. And then they tell me the truth. And I say, well, that's good about your intention. You think you know better. You believe exactly what you said, that if you pass this on, it's going to be very healthy. I said, the question then, if that is your intention, is how are your children receiving it? After all, they came to see me and said, I should talk to you. So how are they receiving it? Well, they're this and that. And I said, no, just for the moment, how are they receiving it? Well, that quiets things down. And then usually the person says to me, what are you asking me? I said, well, I think what I'm asking you is, how long have you been concerned that their dreams are inadequate? Or maybe you don't even know what they are. Maybe you're closer to your grandchildren, which as the Chinese proverb says, the grandparents and grandchildren are the natural enemies of the parents. Maybe you know more about your grandchildren. Well, this begins a healthy, quiet conversation. Now, where's the outcome? And this is all I can offer. The outcome is, then I said to them, well, if it really does matter to you that the proverb is avoided, then you have to step out of this picture. What do you mean, they say? I said, you have to become an elder. You will have to listen like crazy.
And learn like crazy.
Well, first listen. And I said, I think, and I will say, I can't tell you that we'll have a positive outcome, because I don't know how far the energy has already depleted. But I can be sure of one thing, and that is that you will learn a great deal. Now, I want to tell you that most of those people never come back. And that is fine.
Because it's hard to hear the truth.
It's almost unimaginable. I mean this not just in the sense, but it's actually, it doesn't have a place in the brain for a connection to something, and that's fine. I never feel in the least that anyone is wrong. To the contrary. I just believe in offering that kind of thinking and asking people then to consider for themselves. I can do no better than that.
Do no better, but that is a very great question to ask. Now I don't get the parents always in with me. I get the children who come and sit with me and say, we are angry, resentful, we feel minimized, we feel all we are is the custodian of someone else's dream. So if we could invite metaphorically that gentleman in to sit with us and have a conversation with him. I will help him in a certain way to change his perceptions and to help him to see and own his own power and his own vision, his own dream in conjunction with the first generations. How will you help the gentleman who sits here with us and say, my mother is ruling us? And she has no intention to come and see you because she believes that what she's doing is right. And I honor and respect that.
Well, I believe in pictures. I think metaphor is how we learn. I think narrative, which is how we express metaphor, In medicine, there is in America a very old idea that appears to be very new. And that is that the medical schools are teaching the new young doctors now that they must go beyond the first question, which is, what is your problem? They must go to the second question, which is, what is your concern? Now, if I ask any human being, and I have asked this all over the world many times, if I ask you what is your problem, I'll get a 10-minute response, and I could, in theory, fix it or not, depending on my capacity. But if I ask you what is your concern, I know you will tell me your story. You will enter myth, not negative myth, white myth, living creative myth. You'll tell me your story. Now I begin to give you a way to understand your own problem as you express your concerns. And almost always, in the fact pattern that you've suggested, at the end I can say what you know as a great psychologist is true, but you already have the answer.
Yes. Yes.
And they look at me and they say, well, how do you know that? I said, I don't know that. You've told me your answer. Now, underlying that, almost always, is at some point in the life of this child, now 50, 60 years old, someone at the age between 10 and 14 and 15, and 14, 15, very important, no one asked this human being, what is your dream? Ilse, one of the great tragedies of my life, one of the great sadnesses of my life, is so many second-generation people I have met who I am the first person in their lives who has ever asked them with absolute open heart, open mind, what is your dream? Now, I come from a family, not a great family, just a family, and I had an aunt who had no children. It was a gay lady. And she asked me, she asked my brother and my sisters when we were 14 or 15, what is your dream? And she spent her life helping us bring it to life.
That's a gift that she gave you.
Extraordinary gift. So it comes in odd ways, different ways in families. But if someone doesn't care enough about you to ask you at that critical age, when you're individuating, and differentiate around what you learn about yourself, doesn't ask you this critical question, what is your dream? Who are you? Without that love, oh dear, life is very hard. Particularly when you have money, and money is the most difficult thing to deal with. We know that from Freud. But if we don't learn to love, we can't learn to work.
So I want to add something to that. That's also to look in the mirror and love yourself. And ask yourself the question, what is my dream? What is the vision that I have with my life? And how do I take my parents' dream and vision that they had? And whether I agree with it or not agree with it, how do I take my dream and I link it with their dream? And I take the snowball and I grow the snowball.
Yes.
This is the essence of avoiding the proverb.
Yes.
Because it's accreting energy.
Yes.
The energy of the new dream is not at the expense. This, Ilse, is where, again, my conversations with the wealth creators often end. Because the wealth creator's reaction is, oh, that's at the expense of my dream.
No, it's not.
It's
Yes.
the absolute
Yes.
opposite.
It's the expression, the continuation of
Yes.
it. Yeah.
In the Middle Ages in Europe, when a son was born to a king, the son would, after a short period of time, be taken away from his mother. She would see him occasionally, but he would have his own people from beginning. And when he got to be 12, 13, 14, about this age, the king would say, now you must have your own court. You must have your own advisors. You must find your own friends. Now the king knew that the greatest threat to his throne was not the king in the next kingdom, it was his son making civil war on him when he stayed around too long. These were very smart kings. But they also understood that if the son did not individuate, did not discover in himself the courage, the various virtues necessary, he would be a terrible king. So these people understood human behavior remarkably. They understood that if this person did not go on his journey, and by the way, the young women as well, but not quite so much at that time. Thank goodness today, absolutely.
It's different now.
Okay, thank goodness. But people understood that the next king was going to face different problems. There would be different internal issues, external issues. So this person had to go on his journey. And just as Joseph Campbell teaches about the hero's journey, it looked to the young man like it would be like that. No, it was going to go like that. And then he would have to discover, who am I? And from here, with those people, begin the real journey. Great kingdoms understood this. And when the king could not do this for his son or his daughter, often the kingdom collapsed. So we have marvelous historical pictures of how it works. We just don't pay any attention to them.
But just the reminder for the person who's sitting in front of us, of the genius that lives in everyone, and the dream that lives in everyone, and that everyone has the birthright to live that to the fullest.
Ilse, it occurs to me in that beautiful statement that you just made, one of the things I've done in my life, and I have made huge mistakes, and I live at the consequence of them. But one of the things I did decide to do after a very good midlife crisis, in dark wood with nowhere to go, is I thought to myself, well, if you believe in this question of dream, will you act it out?
Yes.
Knowing that, first of all, I'd be a fraud, because I wasn't used to doing it. I wasn't sure I really meant it. So I began, all over the world, anyone I met, I said, do you have a dream? What's your dream? And as I asked this question, I educated myself again about what it is to be human. And I began to see that everywhere I went in the world, no matter the level of financial wealth or education or whatever, every human being I met had a dream.
Of course.
However, what I learned, and now I repeat something I said a minute ago, I said, I think it bears repeating. The tragedy of my question is how often I was the first person who asked. A stranger. A man of no country in a certain sense, simply wandering in the journey of my clients' lives and meeting people.
I must say, I find the sessions that I have with a family member, whether it is the first, second, third, it doesn't matter. When I sit and I help them to connect with their dream, I find that one of the most inspiring sessions, and I often find I sit and cry with them because it is so deeply touching.
Yes.
To help a person to connect with the magic in them.
Yes. And I'm curious, so I'll ask you a question. When I leave, I'll make a statement and ask you a question. When I leave those remarkable moments, and usually the person has left and we've had an emotional goodbye, I sit quietly and I thank my spirit guides for putting me in that position. Because I never know I'm going to be in that position. Do you find that too?
I find after a session like that, that it is of utmost importance to me to go and sit quietly and go into that deep space in my heart of gratitude that I could witness
Yes.
another person's
Yes.
genius. That to me is such a gift, and you never know that you're going to receive that gift.
No.
And for that I am eternally grateful, and that's why I can't stop doing what I'm doing, because of all the gifts I'm receiving from my clients and the families that I'm working with.
Thank you. Thank you.
It reminds me of a 70-year-old, also first-generation gentleman, and he came to me and said, I made huge mistakes in my life. I spoiled my children. I didn't teach them any financial skills. I disempowered them. I entitled them. But I know they've got my genetic predisposition. I know that what I give to them, my legacy to them, is my genes. And I think my genes are good genes. I agree with him because he has shown to be a successful man. He's created a great empire for his family. So he said to me, please help me to change it. And of course, the resistance from the family members said, no, we don't want things to change. And I invited them into a family meeting. And you know what happens when there's not a family that is working from the bonds of affinity, but they work from bonds of blood bonds.
Absolutely.
There was resistance, there was anger, there was such, around the table, I could just feel the heckles were rising. And I was so grateful for the questions that I learned in your book, Family Wealth, and Family, the Compact Among Generations. How do you start a family conversation where there's safety? Please share about what is a great way to have the family around the table. You know that they are not wanting to be there, and you bring in that reminder of bonds of affinity. And also explain, what are bonds of affinity?
Well, affinity, Ilse, is a remarkable word in English, and it is similar in all the Romance languages. It is the word that describes positive connection. Whether it's chemistry, whether it's biology, whether it's psychology, every academic subject. When you speak of affinity, you are speaking of some kind of positive connection.
So it doesn't have to be blood relationship, it can
Oh,
be
no.
outside of that.
In fact, I'm going to say something that I think our audience is going to be a little surprised about. There has never been on the earth a family of blood. Never. Every family begins with two names and two people who have nothing except their common humanity. There's no blood. As one of my teachers said, the only thing that's useful about blood is if you're in the emergency room and you need someone with your type. Otherwise, it's the worst place for your mind and heart to go, because every family begins with bonds of affinity.
It's so
Two people have, and what's very interesting is the first definition in Webster's of affinity is relationships other than by blood. Affinity begins a family. Now, from there, just saying that, and here's something just very practical. I will not help a family. I will not. If an agenda for whatever the meetings are doesn't begin with two names. I won't help. Because they can't form the intention to go back to how they started. As soon as a family puts two names on the top of the meeting, everything's already changed. For one thing, you've regained half your stories. You feel that? Now you have 100% of your narrative intact. Oh, and now you have 100% of all the ancestors from which the genetics come now intact. Ah. Second thing, I don't ask people to start with the most difficult problem. I try to start with something that is really mundane, purposefully, to give people an opportunity to actually understand who they are again. So here are two ideas. I use them from time to time. The first is I say, okay, the first session is going to be the wealth creator and her husband or his wife,
Yes.
and the grandchildren, and you middle generation are going to be quiet. You have no job here.
They can be present, but then
Yes.
be
Oh, yeah.
quiet. Yes, yes.
And the only question is going to be from the eldest grandchild, what was it like, Grandma and Grandpa, for you to be 10 years old? Who were you?
To listen to the stories of the family.
everything changes.
Yes.
Because no one remembers that these were children.
Yes.
Isn't it fascinating? All they know is this colossus, or these colossi. They don't understand these are human beings who had a childhood. What was it about? And that's a great place to start. Another wonderful place to start, and the way these meetings usually work, there's often a dinner the first night, everybody sort of connects, and then the agenda's the next day. And so everyone suspends the feelings that you defined. Don't change, don't change. Suspends this for the next morning. So the dinner is simply contrived. So I do something else. I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Actually, tonight is not just to say hello and get over your travel. That's what we're going to do. We're going to find the biggest round table, or create one ourselves, but reorganize in the dining room. The grandchild who's 7 or 8 years old is going to go first. What do you mean? That's what we're going to do. And here's the only question to that grandchild, or great-grandchild, which is often the case today.
Yes.
Who was the oldest person you knew in this family, and what did they tell you about someone older? And now comes a story. You proceed around the table with every family member speaking in order of age. Two remarkable things happen. First, it gets very quiet, and then laughter, and then quiet and laughter as the stories are told. Now, one of the things that families forget is the married-ins are the only ones who chose to join the family. And no one knows their stories, because there's only one dominant story.
Because they are the outsiders.
Yes, but they're the only ones who chose voluntarily to join, okay? As they tell their stories, they begin to weave a tapestry
And
of,
the stories
of
become-
their story.
Yes.
Look what happens.
Yeah.
Getting bigger. You now begin to actually understand what your system is. Also fascinating, by the time you get to the eldest, who today tends to be in their 80s, they begin to tell a story almost always of their grandparents, and almost always something the grandparent told them about a great-grandparent. And now you are going back to a story about someone often who was born in the 1860s or 1870s. And all of a sudden, you're beginning to create 7-generation thinking. Because you've moved everyone back in time. Their story. Remember, this is their story. It's no other story can be their story. But you also can then say at the end, look what you just did. You wove your story, now 120, 130 years young, and these little ones are going to be 100. Look at your story. What do you want it to be?
And when you listen to the stories of your previous generations, you know that you're a product of their stories. You are here, your mindset, your thinking, your lifestyle is part of your, what they have decided. And when you see where you're coming from, and you see and I love the word bonds of affinity, because that's a warm, caring feeling.
Yes.
Blood bonds are can feel threatening.
Yes.
It helps me to help the families to say now, what is it that you wish for your family 7 generations later?
Yes.
And now you've expanded a vision where before you couldn't see it.
Yes.
And what we would normally have called the first generation, did you notice they disappeared?
Yes.
Because
Yes, that's right.
they suddenly became the 3rd generation of their own
That's right,
families,
yes.
or the 4th. And the mystery of this, the mystery of narrative, there's a terrible trite saying in our field that stories are the family glue. It's trite. It's not wrong, it's just trite. What matters is that those stories are actually being told. So the narrative reality of how we learn, human beings have to be taught to read and taught to write, but stories
You can hear.
are in our nature. It's what it is to be human. So what happens in these very simple, gentle exercises is people quiet down. They come with tremendous anxiety. And if the first meeting is about a big problem, everyone's anxiety will be high, and everyone will have too large a chip in the game. They're playing for the final stakes. Instead of the way you play games, you start learning. You start with a little in the game, yes?
And when you do that, there's a deep sense of belonging, and anxiety calms down.
Yes.
So James, I know that you have a wealth of wisdom, and I know that we can read more about that in your books, and I'm looking forward to have many more of these conversations with you. I think that this is enough for one day. You have given us a wealth of information to go and work through, think about, bring into our lives. If there are any professionals watching this, go and help other families with it, so that we can, as a group of caring families, caring professionals, really strive towards bringing out the best in every human being, helping every human being to live a truly fulfilled and prosperous life. And as Aristotle says, we all have a pursuit for happiness. Mm-hmm. Isn't happiness fulfillment and the ultimate prosperity in all 7 areas of life?
Namaste.
So I want to thank you for this conversation and for the heritage and the legacy that you're leaving for us. Thank you.
Thank you.